Alright, we should be live. So, I'm Saber, and I build commander decks on Twitch and then export all the videos to YouTube, except that I stopped doing all of the card selection videos for all of my decks because there are a lot of boring standing there watching me scroll through a list going, no, no, no. Maybe this one. Sure, let's add it to the list. It's very repetitive, and if nobody else is interacting with me at the time, it's just exceedingly boring. So, we've cut that part out, at least as far as YouTube VODs go, but I still want to show the actual deck building process once we've selected all of the cards. So if you want to join me on Twitch for my streams and give me a follow, you'll know when I go live, and if you want to talk to me during card selection or even deck building, that's fine. I also stream actually playing Magic, mostly on Arena, in fact, entirely on Arena right now, and any other gaming that I'm doing. Doing a Baldur's Gate playthrough right now with me, my brother, and my brother's friend on Fridays, and I usually do the daily climb on Slay the Spire most days, so if any of that sounds at all interesting to you, apparently it's my affiliate anniversary today as we're doing this, so yay. So our commander is going to be Teval, Arbiter of Virtue. So this is the one that's actually from the set as opposed to the one that's from the commander deck. So if you haven't seen her yet, or if you need a reminder of how she works, she is a 5-drop, 2 colorless, black, blue, and green, Sultai Dragon. She has Flying, Lifelink, and your spells have Delve, which means that instead of paying the colorless requirements for the spell, you can exile a card per colorless mana, well, not colorless mana, per generic mana that you want to spend on the spell, and that card will pay for that particular generic mana. So, for example, Teval has 2 generic mana in her cost, so if you were taking the probably ill-advised route of casting another Teval, you could exile 2 cards from your graveyard and pay black, green, blue, or you could exile 1 card and pay 1 in black, green, blue to cast her. And she's a 6/6. Ooh, excuse me. It's okay. I only almost choked to death, and I didn't, so we get to continue. So the big thing about Teval as far as her effects go is that she also deals damage to you, well, causes loss of life to you, equal to the mana value of spells that you cast. So Teval has lifelink, so that goes a long way towards undoing the damage that she does, but you're going to lose a lot of life in exchange for your spells being castable by using the Delve mechanic. So the goal when selecting cards for Teval's deck was cards that put a lot of cards into my graveyard so that I can cast multiple spells in a single turn. Cards that allow me to gain huge amounts of life to offset Teval making me lose life. And really powerful spells that are worth all of these hoops jump through, so that way when you cast a spell super early off of Teval, you actually get the full value of that spell early, rather than, just casting it ahead of time and having it be the thing that dies instead of your other stuff. So with that being said, so this one took a while to select the cards, and it shows because it is nearly 300 cards long, so this is going to be really rough on my voice. But let's get through them. A lot of them are very simple and don't require a lot of explanation. Alright, so we have a lot of the cheap Reanimator cards. Animate Dead being the first one on the list. So we're going to see a whole bunch of them because we are intentionally putting cards into our graveyard to fuel Teval. So getting something out even further ahead of schedule by casting Animate Dead or one of the similar spells on it just plays into what Teval's already trying to do and gives an alternate route to that. Also, it doesn't cost a whole lot of life if Teval's out, and you can exile like 1 card and pay a black mana and take 2 damage. And it makes it a lot easier to cast other spells in the same turn when these spells are already cheap and high impact. If you do not have the dual lands, do not worry. They are not essential. I have them, so I run them, but if your playgroup does not allow proxies and you don't have any of the original dual lands or any of the other insanely expensive cards, most of them are not super necessary. There are a few cards that are very difficult to find replacement level cards for, which will require you to just adjust the deck a little bit if we do decide to run them. But for the most part, even the very, very expensive cards have some budget workarounds for them relative to their incredibly high monetary value anyway. But yeah, the dual lands are the least essential. I tend to run a full set of dual shocks and fetches along with some of the other dual type, like the actual dual typed lands. So everything from the commons from Dominaria United and the snow covered ones from Kaldheim. And the Battle for Zendikar buddy lands, the triomes when they're available, when I'm actually running a 3-color deck or more. So I run all of those and all of the fetches that will grab my colors. But this is not 100% essential. This is just my playstyle at this point, and because I have access to them. So don't worry. The lands coming into play untapped and not dealing you any damage for doing that does matter, but the number of games that will be decided because of that is actually a relatively small percentage. So if your table is not made up of people that either have these cards or allow for proxies in order to be able to play with these cards, then you're probably not going to need them anyway because you're going to be on a level playing field with the people you're playing against. Counterspell, so we have a whole lot of interaction on the list. Counterspell is one of the cheaper ones. It might go away in favor of cards like Mana Drain just to stay on the list, because we'll only have room for so much interaction, but it's one of the default ones because it's relatively cheap and deals with everything. Dark Ritual actually makes this list because not only do you get the 3 mana for casting it, you can then also exile the Dark Ritual for the extra generic mana in your spell. So Dark Ritual is giving you the full 3 mana at this point to be in the deck, as opposed to costing 1 and giving you 2 back. Demonic Tutor, literally one of the best tutors ever printed, if not the actual best tutor. You can also argue that a card like Tinker, because it goes through your deck and finds the card, is a tutor, but putting it directly into play is a huge difference, and would be one of the cards that you could argue is better than Demonic Tutor if you're going to argue that Tinker is a tutor card, as opposed to a way to cheat powerful artifacts into play. Soul Ring, because even the people that banned all the other fast mana just can't bring themselves to get rid of Soul Ring, so neither will we. Alright, so here's another insanely expensive card that you're not going to have access to if you're not using proxies and you haven't been playing since, the mid-90s. So, Bazaar of Baghdad taps to draw 2 and discard 3, which gets a lot of cards into the graveyard quickly, while still letting you find the cards that you need, so that you actually have spells to cast. It's not essential, and it's also not a land as far as the count goes. And that's a very important distinction. It does not tap for mana, so it does not count towards the 40 land that I'm going to be running for this deck. So, if you do need to replace it with something a lot less powerful, like the Magus of the Bazaar, for example, or similar cards that let you loot, again, it's not essential, and you can do that as long as you're okay with the lower power level of the deck. Like I said, I have a Bazaar, so I'm running it, or at least I'm going to consider running it. It might not even make the final deck, honestly. Bazaar of Baghdad is one of those cards. It can be extremely powerful, even in Commander, where you can't have 4 of them and you don't want to mulligan to Oblivion to find it. But we'll have to see how many actual dredge cards and similar effects we wind up with, where the Bazaar is at the height of its power. Power Leech is a card that got picked up early. Whenever opponent's artifact becomes tapped, or its activated ability that isn't a top activated ability is activated, I gain 1 life. Which can really offset the damage Teval's doing to me if somebody's using a lot of treasure, since they do tap and sacrifice to make their mana. Also works with any other artifacts that they're constantly activating. Mana drain's on the list for the same reason as Counterspell. Alright, here we have another card. So, this one's been mitigated a bit for the financial devastation it causes because the rules of Magic have changed enough that it's no longer viable in the formats where it used to dominate. So for a limited time in Magic, somewhere between, I want to say somewhere around 1999, like I think the 6th edition rules changes is where they finally got rid of this. You used to not die until a phase or step ended with you at 0 life. So if you went to 0, you had a very brief window to get back above 0 in order to not be dead. And Mirror Universe is one of the premier cards to use in conjunction with that. It also took a lot of inspiration from the mana burn mechanic that used to be around, where the player would just intentionally float all of their mana, cause themselves to lose a large amount of life, then on their upkeep, deal the last point of damage to themselves, typically with City of Brass, because it dealt you a damage when it tapped for mana, because if you waited until the end phase to take mana burn, it would be too late and you would die at that point. So they would deal the last point of damage to themselves and then swap life totals, which is Mirror Universe's whole thing, is to exchange life totals. You can only activate it during your upkeep. It costs 6 mana to cast and no additional mana to activate. So the goal is to exchange life totals with the opponent after we've dealt ourselves a ton of damage with Teval. And I don't know if this is even going to make it all the way through. The fact that it's limited to your upkeep and you have to still be alive at that point means that it's a lot less likely to work the way I want it to. And we do have Soul's Conduit on the list and Profane Transfusion. So both of those can also allow you to exchange your life total with another player's, and we might be using one of those instead because of that. But I wanted to leave myself the option to run Mirror Universe. Stone Calendar, so if you've ever watched any of my other videos where I talk about my opinions on things like the medallions from Tempest and whatnot, so the way I tend to look at cards like that is how many spells per turn cycle am I going to be able to cast if I have this thing out? Because if it's only enabling like 1 additional spell per turn cycle, then it's the same as a mana rock that taps for whatever mana you just shaved off of the spell. So if it costs 1 generic mana less, then you've saved yourself an entire mana, so it might as well have been a Mind Stone at that point for the same cost. So, in order for me to run a card like this, I need to be able to cast consistently 2 or more spells per turn. Like, if I cast a 5 mana rock, I want it to be adding somewhere between 2 and 3 mana to my mana pool every turn cycle. So, Stone Calendar is on the list because we might actually be able to get that out of it. Also, shaving mana off of the casting cost of our spells has a little bit more value in Teval, because the fewer cards we have to exile for Teval, the more spells we have access to on future turns, the more mana we have to work with. So, not only is it technically saving us mana on the turn cycle, but it's also leaving more cards behind for future turns. So, that's the reason why Stone Calendar might actually make the deck this time. And I have no idea what a Limdar is, but apparently it was a real word and it did not feel the need to correct me. So that's neat. Dance of the Dead, similar to Animate Dead. It buffs the creature instead, but makes it so that the creature requires a 1 black to untap it during my upkeep, rather than untapping naturally. So Fortunately, we're saving enough mana with Teval that I'm pretty sure paying the extra 2 mana to get a powerful creature into play early and be able to use it with a slight buff on top of that is worth the cost. But if I decide I don't need all the reanimate spells, then Dance of the Dead is probably going to be, if not the first one to go, then the second one. Nature's Lure to ramp, Force of Will because we're playing blue. The downside to Teval, so I've been over this while doing the card selection a lot, but since this is the first one that's going on YouTube, I feel I need to go over this because a lot of newer players get this one wrong. So, Teval makes you lose life equal to the mana value of the spell that you cast. The mana value of a spell is fixed if it does not have X in it. So, Force of Will is always 5, regardless of how you cast it. If you cast Force of Will for its alternate cost of losing a life and exiling a blue card, you are still casting the spell and its mana value is still 5. So Teval is going to dome you for 5. There is no getting around that except with X spells because you get to set what X is, and while it's on the stack, that's the value for X. That is the only way to change the mana value of the spell. Everything else is completely locked in. So, for a lot of cards that are free under certain circumstances, that's not helping us. Teval does not care how much mana was spent to cast the spell. She cares that you have cast the spell at all and what its mana value was supposed to be. So, Force of will dome us for an extra 5 if we cast it, even for the alternate casting cost. And that will be true for all of the cards that we'll see on the list. But it also works in our favor for certain other things. For example, Kicker is an additional cost to cast the spell that you can pay when you're casting it, and Teval lets you exile cards to pay generic mana for that. So if you have a card with a high Kicker cost or with multi-Kicker, you can actually keep exiling the cards from your graveyard to help pay for that, and Teval will only look at the actual mana value of the spell. It won't care about the Kicker costs that you paid. It won't care if you paid less mana for other reasons or more mana for other reasons. As long as it sees the casting cost in the top right corner, that's the only thing you're going to get hit for. So we can circumvent some of the things by casting a spell for a lot more mana than the amount of damage that we're going to take. Kicker is one of the best ones. Effects that work similar to Kicker also help. Flashback can work in that usually the initial cost is cheaper than the flashback cost. So if we do flash it back, we're still only taking the initial hit in the upper right corner, not the higher flashback cost. And there's a whole lot of other stuff like that. So I just thought, since we're on Force of Will, that bears repeating, because newer players do not grasp that concept very early on. They think that the mana value of the spell is the amount of mana that you spent on it, and that is not true. It is always the actual printed casting cost of the spell. Grim Feast. So when one of our opponent's creatures dies, we gain life equal to its toughness. Grim Feast does ping us for 1 damage on our upkeep. I think that's worth considering, because if we spend a bunch of life to kill a lot of their creatures, then we're probably going to gain a whole lot of life back. And that will undo a lot of the harm that casting an expensive spell like in Garrick's Wake, for example, to kill all of their creatures. If we could offset the 9 life that we're about to lose from having casted in the first place, that is super helpful. Mystical Tutor and Worldly Tutor, and Vampiric in Visions, all tutors. All letting us grab the important cards in our deck when we need them. Necromancy, so if Dance of the Dead is not the first Reanimator spell to go, I think Necromancy will be. It's a little bit more expensive than the other ones, Animate Dead and Dance of the Dead. It does have the ability to be cast at instant speed, with the caveat that you will have to sacrifice the creature at the end of turn if you do this. But with enough good comes into play abilities, death triggers, and all of that, that might still be worth it. Buried Alive to put creatures from our deck directly into our graveyard. So Buried Alive can be a ritual. Putting itself and 3 creatures into the graveyard gives us 4 mana towards spells with Teval in play. It can also put the creature we most want to reanimate into the graveyard relatively early, so that way we can get it back and just pick up right where we want to be at, rather than having to wait until we get the creature into the graveyard some other way. Or until we draw it so that we can discard it to the 1 effect that we have. And in the same vein as that, Intuition, which lets us tutor our deck for 3 cards. An opponent chooses one of them to go into our hand and the others go to the graveyard. I have not added Gifts Ungiven, I don't think, to the list because it had not been unbanned when I started this list and I was past Champions of Kamigawa while doing the card selection at the time. So we might lose Intuition in favor of that. Lotus Petal, similar to Dark Ritual, not only do we get the mana from the Lotus Petal, we can then exile the Lotus Petal for functionally another mana. So it is a 0-cost 2-mana ritual at that point that we can sit on and wait until the time is right in order to use it. Reanimate is probably the best reanimation spell ever printed. We do take a hit equal to the casting cost of the creature that we bring back, but since we're reanimating it, we're not casting it, so Teval only domes us for the 1 for the reanimate cost. So it's essentially paying an extra life to get the creature into play anyway from what we would have lost if we had cast the creature normally, and we're saving all of the mana of the creature. So Scroll Rack lets us set up the top card of our deck and exchange cards that we don't want at the time for the potential for new cards. Also, with all the fetch lands I'm running, we can easily shuffle away the cards that we don't want if we don't have a way to mill them at the time. I have the 3 default Time Walks on the list, so Time Warp, Capture Jing Shao, and Temporal Manipulation. I believe I also have Expropriate on the list because it is a big bomby spell that swings the entire game, and if we're not trying to cast those with Teval, I don't know what we're doing. I do not currently have Time Stretch on the list, though, which I could theoretically add. Time Stretch is one of those cards that always scares me, though, not because I'm worried about, the big mana cost to it. I am always worried that somebody is going to cast that for me and against me, because I have it in my deck. One of my favorite things to do with decks that can steal opponent's spells is to find a card like Time Stretch. So we are running Expropriate, though, and under most circumstances, the person can also steal Expropriate in those scenarios, so it's entirely possible I should be running Time Stretch also. We have a bunch of card draw spells that have very little colored mana in them, with the idea that this will get us more spells to work with Teval, and also will put themselves into the graveyard to fuel the next spell. Some of them also have discard requirements like Sift here, so we'll be able to put another card into the graveyard on top of that. Time Spiral. So this one and the similar spells to it, where you get to untap lands when you cast it, means that what we can do is we can exile the cards from our graveyard to pay for the generic mana cost. Especially with Time Spiral, exiling cards that we don't want to redraw is particularly helpful. And then tap all of our lands for mana, and then untap the 6 lands with the Time Spiral effect. So we would untap the 2 blue sources that we used and 4 others, and have access to that 4 extra mana. So even though the rest of our graveyard is going away now, we still have 4 extra mana to work with in addition to whatever other mana we had access to. So we should be able to start casting spells and get more cards into the graveyard and refuel Teval from there. And we're getting the first crack at the cards off of Time Spiral, so as the active player who casts the spell. Victimize is another reanimate spell, sacrificing one of our creatures to bring back two of them. All of our creatures are either utility creatures or very heavy hitters, so sacrificing even a big creature to get back two other big creatures is probably still worth. Windfall is another way to draw a whole lot of cards for very little mana, and because we are discarding our hand, we'll get cards into the graveyard to make up for the 2 generic mana that we paid by exiling cards in the graveyard. Defense of the Heart, relatively cheap spell that gets us large creatures if our opponents have a board state. Frantic Search is another untap the lands effect, and it's putting more cards into the graveyard to help us pay for it. Memory Jar, draw 7, end of turn, discard those 7, take back your original hand. Puts itself and definitely, in some way, 7 cards into the graveyard, unless opponents have their own effects that are stopping our cards from getting there. So at the very least, it's going to give you 7 cards in the graveyard to work with the spells that were in your hand originally, when you get that hand back later. Palinchron untaps up to 7 lands. You can't really go infinite with Palinchron in this deck because, A, you're exiling cards from the graveyard to get around the cost, so there's only so much you can do there, and B, you're taking 7 damage every time you cast it, so. But the access to additional colored mana, one of the big bottlenecks that we're going to, there are 2 big bottlenecks in the deck. One of them is colored mana, the other one is life total. So things that can increase our life total and things that can give us access to a lot more colored mana are things that I'm interested in, and the Urza's untap number of lands equal to the mana value of the spell that you cast spells do a lot of heavy lifting for that. So Subversion to drain all of our opponents. I don't know if this is going to make it because it's a little bit expensive for the small amount of life that it's draining, but it is one of the older effects where you gain life equal to the total life lost this way. So even though each opponent is only losing 1, you're gaining 1 for each opponent you have instead of only the 1 life that a lot of the newer cards will do, where it's like each of your opponent loses a life and you gain a life, as opposed to this wording, which is you gain life equal to the life lost this way. Treachery steals their best creature and untaps 5 lands. Foster, so when my creature dies, I can pay 1 to reveal the top card of my library until I reveal a creature card. I put that creature into my hand and the rest into my graveyard. So when one of my creatures dies, I get to pay 1, reveal the top card of my deck until I hit a creature, and then the rest of those cards just go to the graveyard and fuel Teval. And I am very excited for anything that puts a large number, possibly arbitrarily large number of cards into my graveyard in the early stages of the game especially. Fact or Fiction, one of the better cards for card draw, and the cards that you don't get go to the graveyard. Plague Spitter is in here because if we can give it lifelink, and we do have a lot of ways to give our creatures lifelink, it dealing 1 damage to each creature each turn and each player means that we could gain a ton of life off of this thing every turn until it dies. Pernicious Deed, one of our big removal spells, hits almost everything. Entomb to put a specific card into the graveyard as cheaply as possible, so that way we can reanimate it later. Pedantic Learning, because I'm planning on milling myself a lot, putting lands into the graveyard from our deck means we get to draw cards every time that happens. And I'm just interested in having as many cards to work with as possible. Traumatize. So Traumatize can probably be replaced with the new spell, the new Adventure Land from Final Fantasy set. It costs 1 more than Traumatize and has the exact same effect for the adventure, and then the land can be played after that as it comes in and play tapped blue land. It's possible I even want both of them. Putting half my deck into my graveyard is incredibly helpful when Teval's active. Mental Note draws me a card and then mills me 2, so it puts itself and 2 cards into my graveyard. Technically, this is the one that mills 2 and then draws 1. There is a card from one of the later sets that is the draw one first and then mill two, Thought Scour. There's all of our fetch lands from Onslaught. And Oversold Cemetery as a way to get back our dead creatures, since we're going to put so many cards into our graveyard. Being able to pull back the most dangerous creature we've lost potentially every turn until it kills our opponents. Rush of Knowledge is another way to draw a lot of cards for a relatively reasonable casting cost. Fabricate to tutor artifacts. Lightning Greaves to make sure Teval and our other scary creatures have haste. Mindslaver, because shaving up to 6 mana off of the casting cost of Mindslaver makes it a lot easier to cast and activate in the same turn and ambush people with it, and it's still cheaper to do that overall than it is to try and cast Worst Fears, and also Worst Fears does exile itself, so we can't get it back. Mindslaver, on the other hand, we might be able to loop at least a couple of times, if not repeatably. Oblivion Stone is one of my favorite catch-all removal spells for when things have gotten out of hand and you just need to reset the board. So we don't have any 2-card win con effects with Tooth and Nail, so it is in here specifically to be a value card. But being able to tutor up like the vampire that gains us life when opponents lose life, and any of our other terrifying creatures is probably still worth it. Just being able to tutor and put them into play means that it'll be very difficult for us to not come out ahead on life and mana in this deck with the type of things that we'll be tutoring for, even at 9 mana and 7 life lost. Yeah, and Twine functions like Kicker in regard to Teval, so we're only ever losing the 7 life, even if we do kick it. Well of Lost Dreams, whenever we gain life, we can pay X to draw up to X cards, based on the amount of life that we gained. Crucible of Worlds, to play lands from the graveyard. A lot of times, land are the easiest thing to exile for things like Teval's Delve, but at the same time, if we can replay the land, then we have access to that mana every single turn. So, also, if we can replay fetch lands, we get to put them right back into the graveyard and go get a different land from our deck, so we have the land still in the graveyard to be exiled if we want it, and the mana from the land that we fetched. Eternal Witness, because we're putting so much of our deck into our graveyard at any given point in time that we're bound to want to pull back some number of cards, and Eternal Witness gets back everything, and is a creature, which makes it easier to get her back if she doesn't get exiled. Kokusho, the Evening Star, similar to Subversion, drains all of the opponents for 5 when it dies, and we gain equal to the total amount lost, so that will give us a huge amount of life. 10 for 2 opponents, 15 for 3, and so on. Meosion of Night's Reach is one of the more powerful Meosion, I feel like, that we can ramp into with Teval. Being able to take away each opponent's current hand of cards makes the Meosion basically a must counter. And when the card is that dire, I think we should be running it. Especially in a deck with what should be a very high power level. I did not discuss this before, but Teval is most definitely going into... If 5 is CEDH, which I believe it is, then we're looking at a 4, because that's the power level I build most of my decks at anyway, and Teval should be a very high 4, I feel like. Like, the ability to discount your spells based on cards in graveyard is just going to be a huge thing for Teval. Nezumi Grave Robber is one of my preferred graveyard hate cards, but we do also have Scavenging Ooze, and the Ooze will win out over the Grave Robber in this scenario. Steve, in order to ramp, Sensei's Divining Top. I run all of the fetch lands that I can, and a bunch of other cards to manipulate the top of my deck, or to let me shuffle, So Sensei's Divining Top is just an auto-include in nearly every deck that I build. It's more of a personal preference, though, than a thing that I think everybody needs. Compulsive Research. Out of all of the draw 3, discard a specific card or 2 cards, I think land is the one that we are most able to discard because we have the most ways to get it back for no actual mana investment after the initial casting of the spell that's letting us get lands back every turn. And I wanted another card that lets me draw some cards and then discard some cards in order to get mana effectively back into the graveyard. Farseek for ramp. Golgari Grave Troll as the single best dredge creature made it into the deck. The Imp did not, though. That lets you mill 5. And it's possible that I want that one too, but I want to see if Golgari Grave Troll makes the final build first, and then we can decide if we want the other one also. Commandeer, similar to Force of Will, we are going to take the big hit for 7, but we're also going to bypass the 5 mana sometimes instead of having to lose 2 blue cards from our hand. So being able to cast this for just 2 blue mana to gain control of the spell while it's on the stack and get the benefits of it. Notably, gaining control of the spell on the stack does not make us cast the spell, in air quotes for cast, so we are not losing life equal to that spell's mana value, because it was never cast by us, we just are the ones controlling it now. Herald of Leshrac is one of those cards I keep trying to jam into decks, and this might be the deck for it, stealing all of our opponent's lands. I was not sure if I was going to bother with a card like Zoran Orb, though, where I might be able to sacrifice all the lands rather than give them back eventually. But on the bright side, we should be able to get the Herald back and start stealing all of their lands again, even if it does die. And if we can't kill all of our opponents while they're incredibly low on lands and our graveyard is fueling our spells, then I don't think we can win that game anyway. Anna Battle Mage. I was just curious if I wanted this thing. Honestly, the ability to make an opponent discard 3 cards can be incredibly brutal, but most of the time it's not going to be. Dealing damage, like targeting a creature and having that creature deal damage to its controller equal to its power, on the other hand, can do a large chunk of damage, and if we have any of our opponents lose life, we gain life effects going on. That can be really potent. Also, it's one of the few early creatures we can have. Speaking of early creatures, right after Damnation as our default Wrath, like 4 mana, kill everything, we have Essence Warden, who is the green color-shifted Soul Warden. So this triggers whenever any creature enters the battlefield, not just ours. So opponents that are making a lot of tokens or that have creatures blinking a lot will give us a bunch of life at least for all of that, and then it's on us to figure out how to deal with all of the advantage that they're getting from that. But at least we're gaining a ton of life, so that makes it easier to cast spells under Teval. Polluted Bonds to drain the opponents for their landfalls. Being able to gain 2 life every time an opponent plays a land seems really good in a deck that desperately wants to gain a lot of life. Woodfall Primus, one of my favorite removal spell creatures, destroys any non-creature permanent, so it can even hit lands, and then the first time it dies, it comes back with a -1/-1 counter. And that's just way too good, especially if we're going to reanimate it early. Things like instant speed Necromancy, for example, and then we have to sacrifice the Necromancy, which kills the creature, which will then persist back with the -1/-1, so... Glenalendra Archmage, just a good control-y card, especially if we don't have to spend the full 4 mana on her. That makes it a lot easier to have mana left over, including for her activated ability. Minion Reflector, so there are a handful of cards on this list that if I have some extra mana when I cast a spell or when a thing happens, I basically get to double up on that thing. Minion Reflector is the one for creatures. It makes a token copy of the creature with haste that I have to sacrifice at end of turn. But if I'm shaving all of this mana off of the casting cost with Teval, then I almost definitely have mana left over for effects like this if I want to. So I wanted to include a bunch of those in case I decide this is the best way to save enough mana that I can afford to do the thing each time. So in this case, make a token copy of a creature I just had enter. Quite a Spike and a few other cards are on the list because of the opponents lose life, I gain that much life effects. Exquisite Blood and the Conqueror from Foundations being the two primary ones. So if an opponent ever loses half their life, I will gain that much life back, even without other effects caring about how much opponents lose life. So I don't have any of the insta-win combos, though, any of the wound reflection cards in the deck. I am doing this primarily to make opponents lose a massive chunk of life, and there are a whole bunch of them on the list, so I can see, like, most of them getting cut. Since there are only a few cards that actually straight up drain the opponent, like, actually let me gain the life equal to the amount of life that they're losing, so. But I put all of them on the list so I can figure out which ones, if any, I want to run. Bloodchief's Ascension, once it's online, any card going to an opponent's graveyard will give us 2 life. Also makes them lose 2 life, so deciding to actually target the opponent instead of ourselves with Traumatize suddenly starts looking a lot more fatal for that particular player. Hedron Crab, landfall, I mill a player 3. Almost definitely want to mill myself until we have a large graveyard, then we can figure out if we want to mill opponents. Also has the added side effect of if we crack a fetch after somebody plays anything that lets them look at the top card of their deck or put a card on top of their deck and they leave that card on top, lets us get rid of those cards. So all of the like Mirage style tutors, any scrying or surveilling where they leave the card on top, that sort of thing. Oracle of Moldiah, because I want as much mana as I can possibly have access to. It's a source of card advantage. We have enough ways to manipulate the top of our deck that we can put lands on top in most scenarios also. Between being able to, like, Sensei's Divining Top, Scroll Rack, similar effects. Rite of Replication is one of the more powerful kicker spells that I found, where, especially that the kicker cost is almost entirely colorless. There were a few that would have been fine if the kicker costs were colorless instead of very color intensive, but Rite of Replication is one of the strongest ones we can have, where we can spend 2 blue on this, take 4 damage, and exile up to 7 cards from our graveyard, and then get 5 copies of whatever my best non-legendary creature is, or whatever the best non-legendary creature in general is. I'm probably going to want to copy my own stuff, though, since a lot of it helps me with gaining life, opponents losing life, and all the things that Teval really wants. Mostly cards in graveyard. Nighthawk, one of the more efficient flying lifelink creatures. All the fetch lands again. Basilisk Collar to give Death Touch and lifelink. Jukabog to eat graveyards. So there aren't a whole lot of X spells on the list. In fact, I believe Exsanguinate is the only one that actually made it on. So X spells, as I said, whenever you set the value for X, that's how much life you're going to lose to Teval, in addition to whatever else is in the casting cost. So if we cast Exsanguinate for X equals 5, we're going to lose 7 life, and we're going to lose the 7 life before Exsanguinate resolves. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Teval hits us for casting the spell, so even though we're going to gain a ton of life from Exsanguinate, we need to live through casting it, so you can't cast an Exsanguinate for lethal if you would die from the damage before the opponents would. I mean, we can, but that's kind of the worst idea. I always like to point that out, though, especially when I'm playing draft. It's like, okay, technically you can do that if you would like to, but I don't recommend it. But yeah, Exsanguinate, because it's one of those you gain life equal to the total life lost, it's really easy to recoup your life as long as you don't die to it in the first place. Platinum Empyrean is one that I'm kind of struggling with. Your life total not being able to change does not go into effect until the card is actually in play, so we will take 8 from casting this thing if Teval's in play, and then we can't gain any more life after that. We also can't take damage until this thing goes away, but it does mean that we're going to miss out on any potential life gain while opponents are looking for removal for this thing. And if they kill it in response to one of our spells with Teval's trigger on the stack, we will take the damage again. So, things to consider when we're trying to decide if we want Platinum Empyrean. Wormcoil Engine, Lifelink Death Touch, big body, can be cast for basically free. Consecrate Sphinx can draw us a ton of cards. Fangren Marauder. So, I've put this in another deck where I knew the opponents were going to be getting artifact mana from us. And I just wanted to gain the 5 life, or where I knew we were sacrificing a ton of artifacts. It was one of those two. And I wanted the life gain off of it. So whenever an artifact dies, I gain 5 life, and it doesn't matter whose artifact. So opponents that are making tons of treasure give us 5 life every time they spend a treasure. And that is kind of a huge deal. And we don't need to lose very many of our own artifacts just to normal stuff like, our artifact creatures getting into combat, our tokens getting sacrificed, any of that in order for the Fangren Marauder to be worth it. Mirrorworks is for artifacts as Minion Reflector was for creatures, except that the Mirrorworks does not require that you sacrifice the artifact at end of turn. So it just gives you another copy of the artifact if you have 2 mana lying around. Sangromancer. So we don't really make our opponents discard cards, but that doesn't mean they won't for their own effects. We do have a couple of cards like Windfall, which might be relevant to that. But opponents' creatures dying are just going... That's the thing that's just going to happen. Like, creatures die all the time in Commander, and I would love to gain 3 life per dead creature. Batterskull, lifelink creature, can give lifelink to other things. Beast Within, catch-all removal spell. Karn Liberated, same, but without giving them the 3/3. Metamorph, to copy the best thing on the board. Original Sheoldred. This one might go in favor of other similar cards, but she's a reanimation effect and a constant edict going on for each opponent as the turn cycles keep going. So it's really hard to not have any opponents lose anything to Sheoldred. They have to kill her almost immediately, or somebody's going to lose something. So at least we're getting like 1 creature out of the deal. But if she does not die, we're getting so much more out of it. So there's Soul's Conduit for exchanging life totals. Sword of War and Peace for gaining life. Vorinclex for the extra mana that he provides. There's Thought Scour. Tracker's Instinct. So this thing has flashback, so it's top 4 cards in my deck. I can put a creature into my hand and the rest go to my graveyard. And then I can cast it from my graveyard and put another 3 cards in my graveyard. Or 4 if I don't take a creature. Exquisite Blood. I think it's only the 2 effects that actually give me life when opponents lose life for any reason. But they're both pretty powerful when I need to gain a ton of life, so. Ulvenwald Tracker is in here to make our creatures fight our opponent's creatures. Hopefully, we'll be making a creature with lifelink fight in almost every scenario. And we do have a reasonable number of Death Touch creatures and the Basilisk Collar in the deck also. So we should be able to kill anything that's problematic if we really desperately need to and we don't have any other options. Overload works like Kicker. We pay the alternate casting cost, but it still only cares what the printed mana value is. So blue and 6 to bounce all of our opponent's things, and we only take 2 damage. Grave Betrayal. Every time an opponent's creature dies, we get it. And it comes back with a 1/1 counter. So this is one of those cards where I normally don't run it because it's very expensive and then just kind of sits there. But because we'll be able to exile cards from the graveyard in order to cast it, we should still have mana available to do other things, despite having spent most of our turn just dropping a 7 mana enchantment that doesn't do anything. Deadbridge Chant mills me 10 when it comes in, so I'm already down for that. But then it pulls a card at random from my graveyard, and if it's a creature, I get to put it in onto the battlefield, and if it's a non-creature, I put it into my hand. Given that we can sculpt our graveyard with Teval, the fact that this is random basically doesn't matter. Like, if we really specifically wanted one card, we should be able to set it up so that that one card is the only thing left in our graveyard if we really, really want it to be. Assuming we haven't traumatized ourselves first. That one's a bit harder to cast enough spells to make sure that we get what we want. Pontiff of Blight gives all of our creatures Extort in order to try and drain the opponents out. Also worth noting is that Extort stacks, and similar to the other cards, if we're exiling cards from our graveyard, it makes it a lot easier for us to have leftover mana to pay for all of these triggers that are happening every time we cast a spell. So, Progenitor Mimic is another clone that keeps making copies of itself. So if one thing was worthwhile, all of the things are surely worthwhile. Bow of Nylea, so it gives my attackers Death Touch, that's fine. I can use it to gain life. Putting counters on my lifelink creatures is helpful. So, and putting cards that I don't want in my graveyard on the bottom of my library for things like the Deadbridge Chant, or because I have milled myself too enthusiastically and I'm actually in danger of decking out. Bow of Nylea is one of those cards, it's doing so many different things that you really only need 1 or 2 of its modes to be really good in your deck, and it's worth including just because of the versatility on it. And at the other end of the spectrum, Whip of Erebos, which is all about getting my dead creatures back and attacking with big lifelink creatures. Courser of Kruphix, because I want to gain life when I do just about anything, so landfall included. And we get to play the lands off the top. So, Interpret the Signs is a big card draw spell, and like the other ones, I don't know what combination of them I'm running, but when all of my big splashy card draw spells are essentially Treasure Cruise, but starting at a slightly lower casting cost, I'm down for as many of those as I can get. Kruphix lets us carry over our lets us carry over our mana as colorless mana. Between steps and phases, and without an exile effect is kind of hard to deal with. So, I'm already interested in stretching my mana as much as possible. Kruphix is just giving me more ways to have extra mana to work with. So, put it on the list for that reason. Nyx Weaver self-mills and can eventually get back a card from my graveyard. It might not make the final list just because it's kind of low impact. Sidisi gives me zombies when I mill, and I'm going to be milling a lot, and also gives me a way to mill myself through her. Torrent Elemental can be played from exile, so if we exile it in order to, if we delve it away for a spell, we get to put it back into play with its activated ability later on. And then it can die, and then we can exile it again and repeat the cycle. Retreat to Hagra and Retreat to Kazandu are both on here because they gain me life off of landfall and do other stuff too, but mostly the life gain. um, Second Ulamog. So first Ulamog doesn't make it because if it dies, it shuffles my graveyard back in, and I don't want to mill myself with the idea that I'm going to have all these cards to work with, only for all of them to evaporate because one of the cards was Ulamog. But this one has the bigger board impact anyway by exiling 2 permanents when it's cast. So I was already more interested in this Ulamog in the first place. And it can also just sometimes kill people by exiling their entire deck. Void Winnower cuts off our opponents from casting their even mana value spells while being a big scary Eldrazi. Behold the Beyond is 3 tutors stapled together, but we do have to discard our hand, which can work, because now we're putting more cards in the graveyard to fuel the spells that we're getting off of tutoring for it, and making up for the 7 mana that this thing cost. Forgotten Creation lets us discard our hand on our upkeep and draw a fresh number of cards equal to the cards discarded, so more cards in graveyard, and hopefully more relevant spells in hand. Gitrog Toad, every time a land goes to our graveyard from anywhere, we get to draw a card, and gives us an extra land play each turn at the cost of sacrificing our land, but with Crucible effects, even the lands we're sacrificing are going to wind up back in play anyway, and if they don't, at least they're fodder for Teval. Traverse the Uvenwald, we should be able to get Delirium very easily with this deck. The only question is, can we keep Delirium? Like, we can get it very easily, but we also run the risk of eating the cards out of the graveyard, so Traverse is on here in case. I believe we can maintain Delirium when we need it. Eternal Scourge, same as the Torrent Elemental. It gets exiled, it comes back. It can die, and then we can exile it again and just keep doing the cycle. Noxious Gearhulk is one of the better ETB kill a creature effects that we have access to. And it's gaining us life, so it's possible if we kill a large enough creature that we don't even lose life for having cast this thing in the first place. And if we cast it without Teval in play, it gives us more life to work with later on. Disallow, because I always like to have a way to counter activated or triggered abilities in my deck. Things like the cast triggers off the Eldrazi, effects that win the opponent the game, either outright, like Thassa's Oracle, or functionally win them the game, like whatever their combo deck is trying to do, if we could just disrupt it. And a lot of players will jump through hoops to make their spells uncounterable, so being able to counter the trigger is kind of important at that point. Heroic Intervention to protect all of our stuff. Boneyard Parlay, very similar to Tooth and Nail. Regardless of what we're getting back, we are probably getting back way more than 7 mana worth of creatures. Search for Azcanta gives us the Surveil every turn, and then once it flips, gives us a way to dig for our spells that we're looking for. Vern's Son's Avatar gains us life based on toughness. We have a bunch of high toughness creatures in the deck. We actually have the Slinking Sorcerer from the Commander deck that also gives us life based on toughness. So I wanted to see how much overlap there was for that, and while there is some, there's not a ton. But even as long as the creatures have at least square stats, it doesn't super matter that it's toughness. But we do have a handful that have high toughness values. Twilight Prophet, one day outside of limited, like the Commander limited drafts, I will get this thing to actually trigger and make opponents lose some life, and I will get to draw an extra card. Every time this thing gets to City's Blessing, it seems to die, except for like one Commander Masters draft I did. And I think one time somebody else actually got it to get a single card before it died. Blackblade Reforge is a huge power and toughness boost, And we have a lot of lifelink creatures in the deck. Muldrotha, we're putting so many cards in the graveyard. Muldrotha's going to have plenty to work with. Tadiova gives us extra card draw and extra life for landfall. Assassin's Trophy catch-all removal. Doom Whisper to help set up the top of our deck. And to mill us a whole bunch when we don't need those cards. Yes, we're losing 2 life each time, but that's essentially giving us 2 more mana to work with each time also. So, Bond of Insight makes everybody mill, and then I get back a combination of instants and sorceries from my graveyard. Casualties of War. If I'm playing black-green, I'm playing Casualties of War. Literally every time. Karn, Great Creator, is primarily in here to hose our opponent's mana, honestly. If I need to cut him to make room for more relevant spells for the deck, I will. Narset, we have a few cards that let opponents also draw cards when we're drawing a bunch of extra cards, so she negates that. Also, she can go looking for our spells. Tameo lets us mill, stops our opponents from making us sacrifice and discard if we don't want to, and she can regrow any card from our graveyard with her -3. Emery self-mills and lets us cast our artifacts from graveyard. Murderous Rider's a okay removal spell and an okay creature. Oko is an insane removal spell, and he makes food so we can gain life off of him. Sir Conrad punishes opponents for when creatures die, creature cards go to the graveyard from anywhere else other than the battlefield, and when creatures leave graveyard. So between me billing myself to try and set things up and exiling the cards to pay for spells, Sir Conrad should be triggering an awful lot and dealing a lot of damage to our opponents. Also, we can just pay mana to make everybody mill cards. There's a bunch of sirens going by. Atris, similar to Factor Fiction in that whatever pile doesn't get taken goes to my graveyard. Gravebreaker Lamaya is a Entomb plus a large lifelink creature. Polykranos Unchained is just a massive body. If we escape him, and it shouldn't be that hard to get him to escape. And because we can exile cards to pay, escape is actually an alternate casting cost, so we can exile cards to cast him with the escape cost and to pay the escape cost too. You do have to exile more cards, so he's 6 cards to escape. We can exile up to 4 additional cards to shave mana off of the escape cost on him, though, so up to 10 cards total. And then we're getting a 12/12, which if we can give him lifelink, then he can just keep fighting things and gain me a ton of life at that point. Shadow Spear gives lifelink and trample and takes away opponent's hexproof and indestructible. Grove Dancer is one of those cards. This one gives me a life whenever a land goes to my graveyard from anywhere. So if I mill lands, I gain life. If I sack my fetch lands, I gain life back. I don't know if it's going to make it. It does also let me spend 3 mana to self-mill for a card. I love how I just put Uro. Technically I put Uros, but yeah, Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. So we shouldn't have that much trouble getting cards in the graveyard for Uro, and it's gaining me life back and drawing me cards and getting land into play, so. Bastion of Remembrance. I'm not running many of the Aristocrats Drain cards, but I am running like a couple of the enchantment ones, I believe. Definitely this one. Obviously, since it's on the list, but just to make sure that our stuff dying is causing the opponents to lose life and us to gain life also. Brokos, because we can cast him from the graveyard, and he does enhance most of our things. Casting him from the graveyard for his mutate cost isn't particularly helpful for our commander, but turning our other things into 6/6 tramplers is. Karuga is in here to draw us a bunch of cards, because most of our things are expensive. Ancient Green Warden lets me play land from the graveyard and doubles up on my landfall triggers for all those life gain effects. Lithoform Engine, same principle as the other ones. I should have mana left over to copy the spell with it, and we're not casting the copy, so no extra damage. Nighthawk Scavenger, same as Vampire Nighthawk. This is supposed to be the Knoll Priest of Oblivion. Lifelink creature that gets us back a dead card. Seagate Restoration, because it can occupy a land slot right now. I'm still a little iffy on this one, but it is taking up a land slot, so as long as I don't need space for basic lands, it gets to stay. Binding of the Old Gods kills just about anything, then ramps me a land. We have 2 of the lands from this set in Lityar Mirror Lake to make a token copy of whatever the best creature is, because we have a lot of ways to play land from the graveyard anyway, and Port of Carfell actually mills us and then reanimates a creature, so that one is 100% on board with this deck's game plan. Accomplished Alchemist, we are trying to gain lots of life, so a thing that taps for mana equal to the amount of life we gain this turn. Like, if Teval gets to connect with anything in combat, that's 6 mana just from tapping this one card. Jodi, so Jodi lets us pay a mana to cast the spell off of her trigger, which is still an alternate casting cost, so we can still exile a card from our graveyard to copy it. So if we keep hitting instants and sorceries with Jodi, we just get to keep exiling a single card from the graveyard. Possibly that instant or sorcery once it gets there for the next one. Mortality Spear will almost always cost 2, and even if it doesn't, that's fine. We can probably exile the cards from our graveyard. Old Gnawbone, so this is the first set that I look at each time because alphabetically it's Adventures in the Forgotten Realm. Gnawbone's making treasure whenever I connect gives me a lot of extra mana to work with, and I'm already trying to connect with my stuff anyway to trigger the when opponents lose life, I gain life effects, so. Volo, I wanted to see how many things I would have of different types. Also, it not sharing a type with the card in the graveyard is pretty easy to get around. Let's see, Midnight Hunt, Diregraph Rebirth. It has flashback, and it is cheaper based on the number of creatures that have died this turn, so if enough creatures have died, I don't even need to spend the cards in the graveyard in order to help cast it. Dreadhound is similar to, but worse than Sir Conrad. Slogurk, when lands are put into my graveyard, this gets +1/+1 counters, and it doesn't care how they got to the graveyard, like where they came from. And I can remove 3 counters to bounce him, and when he leaves play, I get up to 3 lands back to my hand from my graveyard. So if I do want the lands back, I can get them with him. Meathook Massacre is the other way we have to make opponents lose life when our creatures die, and we get to gain life when theirs die, so both of those are helpful. Henrika Domnathi is a Vampire Nighthawk that can pump your other Vampire Nighthawks and other creatures that share their keywords. Jingatax's Progress Tyrant, if we can get him out fast enough, just stops opponents from being able to cast spells and doubles up on our spells. And I'm already trying to double up on my spells with like 5 other cards in this deck, so might as well. Shigeki gets back cards from our graveyard for his channel cost. Channel is not a spell, it's an activated ability. So it's not an alternate cost to cast Shigeki. So we take no damage, but we also can't exile cards from our graveyard to pay for it. And in the early game, Shigeki can come down and then bounce himself back in order to mill us a bunch and get a land into play. Cemetery Tampering lets us voluntarily mill and gives us a free spell when we have 20 plus cards in our graveyard. Ledger Shredder, every time anybody casts their second spell, we get a loot. And since it's Connive, it can potentially get counters. Shoulder of the Apocalypse is primarily in here because it gains us life when we draw cards. The fact that it will also kill our opponents for drawing cards is just added bonus at that point. Sphinx of Clear Skies keeps doing a Factor Fiction impression for 3 cards, since it's domain-based, and we're going to have 3 different land types almost all of the time. Terra Sunder, catch-all removal spell. I did put Awaken the Woods. I did not remember if this was on the list or not. I do have ways to gain life for creatures entering and other things happening to creatures. So it's probably okay with an X spell that makes creature lands. Also, it makes lands. They are effectively Dryad Arbor tokens, so that will also gain us all the life off of the landfall triggers. That's why it made it onto the list. Cityscape Leveler is a bad Ulamog, and that's not terrible. Like, it still kills things when you cast it and when it attacks, and giving the opponents Power Stones is not that impressive, especially if I happen to have, like, the Power Leech or whatnot, where I'm actually gaining life for them using it. Portal to Phyrexia is just a very high impact spell, making opponents that don't have a lot of creatures sacrifice 3 of them, and getting back a creature every turn cycle. Conduit of Worlds is another Crucible. Breach the Multiverse does a ton of milling and gives me a bunch of free spells. Hoarding Broodlord lets me tutor my best card and is a large flying creature. Invasion of Amonkhet mills me, makes the opponent discard, gives me a card draw, and then the flip side is a 4/4 with the abilities of whatever my best card in the graveyard is. So, Invasion of Vryn lets me copy whatever spell I want once it's flipped, and is a card draw spell. Draw 3, discard 1, so it's even feeding into the graveyard on top of that. Vorinclex, the Saga version, allows us to mill a large number of cards, make our creatures huge for the lifelink, and then lets them fight our opponent's creatures, which if we can get all of those counters onto a bunch of lifelink creatures, that's kind of exactly where I want to be, is then having access to a massive fight effect. Rise of the Witch King lets me make everybody sacrifice a creature, and when I sack a creature this way, I get back a permanent from my graveyard, so we should be able to get a lot of value out of that. Storm of Saruman lets me copy the second spell I cast each turn, and with all of the things I'm doing, that second spell should be pretty impactful to begin with, so getting a copy of it for free once the enchantment is down. In fact, when I added this to the list, I noted that there is going to be times where I can cast Storm of Saruman as my first card, and then very easily cast something else of high impact on the board. Collector's Vault lets us loot and gives us a treasure for 2 mana, so it effectively rebates the mana used to activate it between the treasure and the card being exiled from the graveyard. Gumdrop Poisoner kills things based on life that we gained, and can gain us some life. Up the Beanstalk, a lot of my stuff is expensive, so a lot of extra card draw. Aftermath Analyst to mill myself, and later on to get back lands from the graveyard. Analyze the Pollen, similar to Traverse the Uvenwald, lets me tutor for basically anything. Chalk Outline rewards me when my creatures leave the graveyard by giving me free 2/2s. Urgent Necropsy, we should have the fodder necessary to collect evidence for the casting costs that we need, but we are stretching the graveyard a bit as a resource despite all of the things that we have, so I'll have to see if we have room for that. Rush of Dread can make an opponent lose half their life in addition to discarding half their cards and sacking half their creatures, so for the cards that gain me that much life, I'm interested. This is probably one of the weaker lose half their life effects, but it also doesn't require anything to connect to do it, so. Also of note, Spree is, again, similar to Kicker, so only that little bit of mana to start off with is locked in and decides the amount of damage that we're going to take. So even if we cast Smuggler's Surprise for like all of the effects, we only take 1 damage for the 1 green mana. So we can mill ourselves a bit. We can get creatures back from the graveyard to play, or from our hand directly into play, depending. And we can protect our larger creatures with a Heroic Intervention style effect. Same thing for 3 steps ahead. We're only ever taking 1 damage, and we're getting a cancel, a draw 2, discard 1, and or a copy of whatever the best creature I have in play is. Glarb is a Future Sight effect with a built-in Surveil, with the caveat that I can only cast my higher casting cost spells off of the top, but I do still get to play lands off of him, which is worth noting, so. Lumra mills me a bunch, and then brings all my lands from the graveyard back to play. The Defiled Crypt is giving me a 2/2 every time a thing leaves my graveyard, and it can also regrow one of my creatures. Drag to the Roots gets cheaper when I have Delirium. Nashi mills every time he hits, and he's relatively cheap. Overlord of the Baelmerk mills me a whole bunch. Unstoppable Slasher can cause opponents to lose half their life. And Valgavoth is a giant angry flying lifelinker. I was hesitant to put him on the list because his one effect lets me cast spells that I've stolen from the opponents by paying life, but I don't have to cast any of those spells, and with another large flying lifelink creature that's causing my opponent's cards to get exiled rather than go to their graveyard, I'm probably okay with just that, and every once in a while casting a spell because it's actually going to win me the game. Dredger's Insight mills me a bunch, and then whenever creatures leave my graveyard or artifacts, I gain a life, and then gives me a land, creature, or artifact back. Awaken the Honored Dead is a catch-all kill spell that then mills me a bunch and then causes a thing to leave my graveyard most of the time, in exchange for one of the cards in my hand. Focus the Mind draws me a bunch, discards a card, and sometimes it costs even less to cast. Glacierwood Siege, I can use that to mill myself whenever I cast an instant or sorcery, or I can use it as a way to play lands from the graveyard. Goldkeeper gives me a treasure when my cards leave the graveyard. Prowler lets me mill myself a ton based on lands in play. Lotus Light Dancers lets me entomb 3 cards of 3 different colors. Meringue River Regent. So the Meringue can bounce 2 permanents when it comes in, but it is also a draw 3, discard 1 for 4 mana, and that is also worth considering, honestly. There's Teval herself. Ugin, because we can basically cast him for free by exiling cards, and then we can follow him up with any other colorless spells in our hand, ideally. And he will help us even more by gaining us life and drawing cards while he's at it. There's Temporal Manipulation, Capture, Imperial Seal as a bad Vamp Tutor, 3 Visits as a variation on Nature's Lore, Cultivate to get more land, Grave Titan to play a bunch of bodies. Honestly, I don't know if it's going to make it, but it is a big body that makes a bunch of other bodies. Leyline of Anticipation, so that we can cast our spells on the opponent's turns. Our sorceries and our flashing in our creatures and whatnot. Jace Memory Adept, because he can mill a player 10 cards. He can also draw a card, then mill a player a card. The -7 is not relevant. Jace's Erasure. When I draw, I can make a player mill a card. I don't know if that's going to be too low impact. Phantasmal Image copies my best thing for 2 mana. Runescar Demon is a flying demonic tutor. Swiftfoot Boots to give Teval haste and protect her, or any of my other lifelink things. Primeval Bounty. So landfall, I gain 3 life. Alliance, basically, I get a 3/3. And Prowess trigger, I get to put a 1/1 counter on my creature. Rise of Dark Realms. So even if I'm removing some of my creatures for all of these things, opponent should still have a bunch of dead things if I have my way, and being able to reanimate everything all at once seems pretty powerful. Garrick is another high impact, high casting cost planeswalker that I can run. He can plus to kill a planeswalker or to make a 3/3 death touch, and his -3 kills a creature and gains me life. And his ultimate basically kills whatever player I give it to. In Garrick's Wake to kill all of our opponent's creatures. Alhamrat's Archive to double my life gain and my card draw. Dark Petition. Between getting the rebate on the mana and possibly having 2 instants and sorceries in my graveyard means that this thing is effectively a free demonic tutor under the right circumstances. Meteor Golem as a catch-all removal effect that I don't need colored mana for. Cavalier mills me a bunch and gets me a land from my graveyard and can get a card in my graveyard back on top of my library when it dies. Abyssal Harvester, since I'm milling myself a ton and willing to mill other players, chances are I'm going to be able to make a copy of a creature that went to the graveyard way ahead of schedule. Bloodthirsty Conqueror to gain life. Plea for Power. I am going to butcher the absolute hell out of your name, and I apologize. Gemini Zilaratistic. Thank you for the follow. Welcome to the channel. Sorry about that. Plea for Power. So Plea for Power is where players vote, and it's either Time Walk for 4 mana or Ancestral Recall for 4 mana, and both effects are very, very useful for this deck, so stream's going fine so far. Expropriate, like I said, just massive Time Walk plus steal all the opponent's stuff. Sylvala, because we will often have the strongest creature in play, and that is a lot of extra mana to get out of her. Spellseeker to tutor any of the other cards. Thrilling Encore. Thrilling Encore is one of those cards that I normally don't run because it's very hard to leave up the mana to cast it at the same time that we're casting the spell that's killing everything. But that's a lot less of a consideration with Teval. A lot easier to if the other spell is cheaper than Teval from Teval, then it won't matter that she's gone. When we cast Thrilling Encore, we should be able to still have the 5 mana, and if not, then we'll figure it out. We'll probably wind up cutting it. Force of Vigor for artifact and enchantment removal. Archon of Cruelty gives us a ton of life. 300 cards. That's way too many. Persist to get back one of our dead creatures cheaply. Ripples of Undeath, actually, from Modern Horizons 3, like this terrible bulk rare. Because it mills us 3, and then we get to pay 3 life if we want to get one of the cards back, plus a mana. Which, let's be honest, if I'm gaining as much life as I want to, then I should be good with this card. And for the most part, it's just putting extra cards in the graveyard. 6 to get back the spells that we want with Retrace. And it's also self-milling, Unfathomable Truths to draw a bunch of cards and get a rebate on the mana from the Eldrazi spawn, and the card going to the graveyard. Kodama, when we cast a spell with a high casting cost, we get a free permanent from our hand with lower casting cost into play. Profane Transfusion. This is one of the bigger ones. Like, exchanging two players' life totals and making an XX based on the difference is already pretty huge. The fact that we will take 9 damage from casting this before exchanging life totals just makes it that much more potent. Tormod is another, when cards leave my graveyard, I get a thing, in this case a 2/2 zombie. Champion's Helm, we don't want to copy... Oh no, this is Champion's Helm, sorry. I had a moment where I was thinking it was Helm of the Host. Champion's Helm, just to give Teval power and toughness and make her harder to target. Scavenging Ooze, Graveyard Hate, Ramp with Signet. Bane of Progress is not making it. This was an early edition when I wasn't sure how many artifacts and enchantments we were going to be running. Attempt with Immortality lets me reanimate one of my dead creatures, then each opponent can reanimate a creature, and for each one that does, I get another creature back. I have so many high-impact creatures, so if I can leave their graveyard without anything I'm afraid of still in it, then that's going to be one of the better spells. Raving Dead, Death Touch creature, cuts the opponent in half. Don't know how many of these I'm going to run, if any. Wake the Dead. Can reanimate a whole bunch of creatures. This is the 3rd X spell. I really did have another one. Well, I have 300 cards on the list. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. That there's a 3rd one hiding, but it reanimates all of my creatures with casting cost X or less. Or no, I reanimate X creatures, never mind. Different spell entirely. During combat on an opponent's turn. So we get all of the comes into play abilities, we get all of the life gain from big things coming into play, ideally. Okay, almost there. We're getting towards the end of the list. Siege Behemoth makes it so that my creatures that are blocked can still deal their damage to the defending player. Mirror Match gives me a copy of each creature that's attacking me. This is just a big bomby spell if I'm going to gain a ton of life off of making all of the token copies of the opponent's creatures, or if they have good comes into play abilities, which, you know, it's Commander. We should be able to find some of those when I'm being attacked. Marin gets me back dead cards. Scythe Claw's another half the life total thing. Ikra is... I thought she was called the Slinking Sorcerer, so I'm confusing her with a different Snake Wizard lady. But she is the one that gives me life equal to the toughness of my creatures when they deal combat damage to the opponent. Tygom from the Commander decks. I skip my draw, my upkeep, I look at my top 3, put one into my hand, the rest in my graveyard. The fact that I can exile cards from my graveyard to give -X is probably not relevant, but the giving me the best of the top 3 cards of my deck every draw step and putting the other 2 into the graveyard is helpful. Windgrace's Judgment as a good removal spell. Fierce Guardianship because I'm playing blue. Willow Dusk. So at sorcery speed, I can tap to put counters on one of my creatures equal to the total amount of life I've gained this turn or lost this turn, whichever is greater. That is a lot of counters most turns, regardless of which one it's looking at. Vanewitch Coven gets me back a creature when I gain life. Trudge Garden lets me make 4/4s with Trample when I gain life. Curse of Unbinding. I can enchant myself with this, and I mill until I hit a creature. And then put that creature onto the battlefield. Amber is a lifelink creature that gives me life and blood tokens when my opponent's creatures die. Path of the Enigma is a 5 mana draw 4 that only requires 1 colored mana. Skeleton Crew gives me skeletons when creatures leave my graveyard, and I can reanimate it. Astral Dragon is one of those things where I don't know what I'm doing with it yet, but making 2 dragon token copies of my non-creature permanent, like, there has to be something I can do with this because I have so many different high-end permanents. Lord of Change is a 6/6 flying Ward 2 demon, or Ward 3 demon, that draws me 3 cards when it enters for 7 mana. The squad ability is similar to Multi-Kicker, so I can make more of these things by exiling 2 cards from my graveyard each time. The Primarch is lets me make a whole bunch of 2/2s based on the amount of life I lost in a turn by spending extra mana. Out of the Tombs, my upkeep, this gets 2 counters, then I mill equal the number of counters. If I would draw when I have no cards in my deck, I can reanimate a dead creature instead of losing the game. Shard the Nightbringer, when I cast it, I can have an opponent lose half their life and I gain that much life, which means I will gain double that much life if I have one of the other 2 in play. And then the Lord of the Rings seems to have wandered into this section by accident. And then the rest of the commander cards also, so that's a mistake on my part that I'll fix later. So Obsessed Stalker Golem. So by end of turn, each opponent dealt damage by a copy of this card loses life equal to the life I gain this turn. So if he can hit somebody, and then I can gain 20 life in a turn, that's an extra 20 damage that they're taking. And I really want to gain 20 life. The land, giving our creature unblockable when it's attacking the player with the most life, should be a thing, because I should not have the most life ever until I've won. Felix 5 Boots. Don't know where the Y came from, but doubles up on my triggers for dealing combat damage to the opponents, including the life gain. Heartless Conscription kills everything in play, and then I can cast the stuff from from exile rather. This one, so I do lose the life for casting them from exile, but if I've cast this, then our commander also isn't in play. So if I want to cast anything without losing the life, I can. And then later on, when I'm casting it from exile with Teval, we can use the Delve still at least. They came from the pipes. Manifest Dread twice. When my face-down creature enters, I draw a card. So this is blue and 4 to make 2 2/2s and draw 2 cards. Probably not going to make the final list, honestly. Ancient Cellar Spawn makes my things cost less, and when I cast a spell, if I paid less mana than its actual mana value, an opponent loses life equal to the difference. So if I exile my entire graveyard to cast some big fancy spell, then I've paid way less than the amount of mana it was supposed to, and it does a ton of damage to one player. Metamorphosis Fanatic is a 4/4 lifelink that reanimates a creature with a lifelink counter on it. Other Teval from the commander decks. When it attacks, I mill 3. I can reanimate a land at that point, and when cards leave my graveyard, I make a 2/2 zombie druid. Will of the Temur. I either make a token copy of a permanent, except it's also a 4/4 flying dragon, or a player draws X cards based on the highest mana cost among my permanents. And if I have Teval out, I do both for 6 mana. Teval's Judgment. Cards leave my graveyard. I choose one that I haven't done this turn. I draw a card, make a treasure, or make a 2/2. And Colossal Grave Reaver is a 7/6 dragon. When it ETBs or attacks, I mill 3, and when when I mill at least one creature, I can reanimate one of the milled creatures. On to Fallout with the Wise Mothman, because radiation counters make players mill. So giving myself a radiation counter is fine, and when I mill non-lands, I can put a +1 counter on up to X creatures based on the number of milled non-land cards milled. Master Transcendent can also give players rad counters, and it reanimates a creature that was milled this turn. Let's see. The Scorch Beast is once per turn. When 1+ non-land cards are milled, I can make a 2/2 zombie mutant. Whenever a player mills a non-land, I gain life off the glowing one. And Alpha Deathclaw kills all kinds of things. Oh, sure, jumpstart, real quick. Witch of the Moors, when I gain life during my turn, it makes opponents sacrifice creatures, and I get to regrow a creature during my end step. Creeping Bloodsucker is a much cheaper version of Subversion, at the cost of being a creature. Wait, why is Rodolph on the list? He's black-white hybrid, isn't he? Yeah, he is. That was a mistake. I didn't even notice he got onto the list. Oh, he's dead now. Amzu Swarm's Hunger. Once per turn, when cards leave my graveyard, I make a 1/1 insect and put X/1/1 counters on it based on the highest casting cost among the cards that I exiled. And it gives my insects menace. And Sludge Titan is a 6/6 trampler. When it enters or attacks, I mill 5 cards, and I may regrow a creature and or a land. Okay, that is an hour and a half explaining every single card on the list. And Rodolph is now gone. So next time we do this, we'll actually be removing cards from the list. We need to cut 135 cards. God help me. So thank you for watching. I'll be back on later doing some drafts. And I will see you next time. Have a good rest of your day.